Jim Patillo, litigation partner at Christian and Small in Birmingham, Alabama. Thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm good, Andrew. Appreciate you having me.
Likewise. Hey, you recently wrote an article for the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud that I thought was very interesting, and I kind of wanted to discuss that today. You are helping insurance carriers litigate fraud claims, and you're having this idea about how are jurors going to feel in a post-COVID world? Are they going to be more friendly towards claimants, more friendly towards insurance carriers? Why is that important? Let's talk through that a little bit today.
Well, it's important because it helps guide the course of what fraud claims are going to be pressed through trial and what value we put on them. A lot of these fraud claims, if you make a decision on fraud, it's more than just about that individual case, what it could be settled for versus what the result of trial may be. You're really trying to defend the industry's position as a whole. So you end up spending more on some of these, and you need to know what jurors are going to do with them, how they're going to handle them when they do get to trial down the road. We've got some competing factors since COVID has happened, since the economy's been in flux, and since we've had the global pandemic that determine what jurors we get in a trial and how they're going to view an insurance company saying, don't pay this claimant because they're not only just wrong, they've made this up and are lying about it. So that's what the article looks at.
Fraud isn't always black and white, right? So oftentimes we see that an insurance claim is legitimate, but maybe is padded up, for example, right? So in a post-COVID world, so many people have lost their jobs, lost their businesses. I can really anticipate that there's going to be some claims that may have an aspect of legitimacy to them, but also perhaps a really clear aspect of fraud. So in trial, especially as it relates to jurors looking at this, how do you balance empathy versus facts? You may really feel bad for someone who worked their whole life and lost their business or their home.
Well, and that's where a good defense lawyer can make a difference. You've got claims where the claim itself may be legitimate, but there's an embellishment of the measure amount of damages. Those are a little more difficult because you're not necessarily telling the jury, hey, this guy's made this whole thing up. He put gasoline on his house and burned the house down. Maybe he's saying, I had more contents in the house than I actually did. So you're fighting the margins of the amount of the claim. But it's important for a jury, when you speak of empathy, that's a good word to consider. It's important for a jury to not just understand that their verdict affects the claimant, but if juries and insurance companies are paying out fraudulent claims, that's going to affect all policyholders across the board. So, a lot of times in a trial, a judge will ask which members of the jury or policyholders of the defendant insurance company, and they're struck. Well, 99% of people in the world have insurance for something. So how the industry addresses and fights fraud ultimately affects the premiums that everyone has to pay. So I think jurors on some level need to understand that and have empathy, although it's not a popular word, have some empathy towards the defendant insurance company too.
Absolutely. It goes both ways. And if we allow people to take advantage of insurance carriers, of course, everyone suffers, right? I mean, we can all feel the impacts of that. I think it'll be, maybe you agree with me, many months before we really start to know what happens here. But is there anything maybe in the past, can you give us an example of a case that you've seen that might lead you towards your thinking on how juries might start to take these cases?
Yeah, I mean, the cases that are going to trial now are really cases that were on the docket pre-COVID because all trials stopped for 6 months. Some jurisdictions still aren't trying cases. So how jurors will treat a COVID case that presents a fraud issue sort of remains to be seen. We're looking at those cases going to trial in year 2 or 3 years from now. But take a typical house fire case. If someone is financially pinched, they set gasoline to their business or to their house. Juries pre-pandemic, I think initially will be a little more lenient towards marginal claims, But you've got now jurors who are, if they understand how insurance works and how premiums work, they understand that, fraud issues impact everyone. So if we end up paying out a claim to someone who burned their house down, that's going to encourage more fraud. It's going to raise premiums, and it's going to raise the cost of claims handling for everybody. So, and you mentioned the article I'd written earlier that really looks at what post-COVID juries look like, and there are some competing factors that some lean towards insurance companies, some lean towards claimants. But it's important to understand, what those juries potentially are going to look like, and we'll be watching them as those verdicts come in, and hopefully learning from them. There have been some good focus groups that have looked at it too, but pun intended, I guess the jury is still out on what juries will look like.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's some estimates out there. It costs the average family up to $700 more a year in insurance premiums than it should, just to cover the cost of insurance fraud. So when you hear something like that, your family, my family, if we realize how much extra we're paying, we really start to, I've lost a lot of tolerance for it myself. So I think these are all really interesting. I appreciate you joining us today and helping get the education out there as well, because I think if we could make this insurance industry a little bit more honest, it would benefit everybody. So I look forward to hearing more about this. If you haven't had a chance yet, encourage everybody who's watching to check out the Coalition Against Insurance Fraud website where you can find this article. Very interesting. Jim, really appreciate your insights today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.